said, leaning over the auditorium seats to tell everyone nearby, "That's our son, our only successful child." I sat 2 rows behind them in the shadows, swallowed by the deafening applause of 300 people as my younger brother beamed on stage in his graduation gown. For years, I had been the family invisible girl, the disappointment who didn't fit into their high society expectations. My mother didn't even look back at me when she whispered to a stranger that I was a lost cause. But then, the dean stepped up to the microphone, raised his hand to quiet the crowd, and stopped the entire ceremony. The room fell perfectly silent. When the dean looked directly toward the back row and called out my name, my parents completely froze. Follow my story and see how far my story has reached. My name is Nora Bennett, and I am 34 years old. For as long as I can remember, my life has been defined not by who I am, but by who I am not. I am not the brilliant prodigy. I am not the pride of the family. To my parents, Richard and Eleanor, I have always been nothing more than a ghost taking up space in their grand home, an invisible girl whose only purpose was to avoid getting in the way of their golden child. That title belonged exclusively to my younger brother, Julian. From the moment Julian was born, the world revolved around him. If he drew a stick figure, my mother framed it as a masterpiece. If he failed a test, my father blamed the school system. He was pampered, praised, and protected from every minor consequence of his own actions, while my quiet hard work was treated as an expected baseline, completely unworthy of notice. I spent my entire 20s sacrificing my own comfort, quietly working long hours to keep our family afloat during a major financial crisis they brought upon themselves, yet they conveniently erased my sacrifices from their memory. Now, it was the morning of Julian's graduation from an incredibly prestigious university. The house was a chaotic storm of press suits, expensive perfume, and my parents' anxious, fluttering excitement. As I stood in the hallway holding a thick manila folder tightly against my chest, watching them obsess over Julian's graduation gown, I knew today would be the ultimate test of my endurance. When we arrived at the grand university auditorium, the sheer scale of the event made my chest tighten. The room was buzzing with the energy of hundreds of proud families, filling the massive hall with an overwhelming roar of chatter. But as we crossed the threshold, my father immediately handed my brother his ticket and escorted my mother toward the front. Without a single backward glance, they took their prime, reserved seats right near the stage. I was left standing in the aisle until an usher directed me to the very back, where the shadows of the upper tier swallowed me whole. Sitting alone, I leaned forward, straining to catch sight of my parents through the crowd. That was when I overheard a pair of sharply dressed women sitting just a row ahead of me chatting with my mother, who had turned around to greet them. "Oh, yes, Julian is our absolute world," my mother's voice carried clearly over the dull roar of the crowd. When one of the women politely asked about her other child, my mother sighed heavily, a sound dripping with synthetic disappointment. "Nora? Well, she's just a lost cause, I'm afraid. A total financial drain who never quite found her footing." Her words hit me like a physical blow, completely erasing the reality of the last decade. They had completely forgotten that when my father's business nearly collapsed, it was my secret, exhausting work that paid off their debts. I clutched my folder tighter, swallowing the bitter taste of their betrayal as the lights began to dim. The grand commencement ceremony finally began, and the atmosphere in the massive auditorium turned electric. One by one, names were called, and students walked across the stage to receive their diplomas. I watched from the shadows of the back row, my heart hammering against my ribs as the line of graduates moved forward. Then, the announcer's voice echoed through the loudspeakers. "Julian Richard Whitaker." Instantly, my father stood up from his front row seat, completely ignoring protocol. He threw his arms in the air and turned to face the surrounding crowd of 300 people, shouting loudly, "That's our son, our only successful child." My mother clapped furiously beside him, her face beaming with absolute adoration. The entire room erupted into warm applause for Julian, who stood proudly on the stage, a smug smirk spreading across his face as he soaked in our parents' total worship. From where I sat, The sting of his arrogance was secondary to the deep humiliation burning in my chest. To my parents, my entire existence had been reduced to an embarrassing footnote, completely unworthy of being acknowledged in public. Julian gave a theatrical wave to the crowd, perfectly playing the part of the family savior while I sat abandoned in the dark. But as he prepared to step off the stage, I adjusted my grip on the thick folder in my lap. The painful display of their favoritism was finally over, and the moment I had been quietly preparing for was about to begin. Just as Julian prepared to walk off the stage with his diploma, the dean stepped up to the central microphone, unexpectedly interrupting the standard schedule. The polite murmurs of the crowd died down instantly, replaced by a sudden, curious hush that rippled through the 300 people in the auditorium. My parents were just about to sit back down, their faces still flushed with the pride of Julian's moment, when the dean raised his hand to command absolute silence. Ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed to the concluding remarks of today's commencement, the dean began, his voice booming clearly through the professional sound system. The university would like to make an unprecedented acknowledgement. This afternoon, we are honoring an exceptional individual whose immense generosity and quiet dedication made our entire graduating class's new advanced research facility wing possible. My mother frowned, whispering something to my father as they looked around, completely unaware of what was happening. The dean opened a crisp, sealed envelope with theatrical precision, preparing to read the name of the university's secret, chief benefactor. Without this person's incredible vision and substantial financial backing, many of the programs our graduates benefited from simply would not exist today. The tension in the room peaked, hanging heavily in the quiet air. The dean adjusted his glasses, looked directly past the front rows, and focused his eyes toward the upper tier. Please join me in expressing our deepest gratitude to our primary donor, who requested no recognition until today, Nora Bennett. The camera angle focuses on Richard and Eleanor as their proud smiles instantly turn to masks of pure horror and confusion. The dean paused, letting the weight of my name hang in the absolute silence of the auditorium. Slowly, he looked up and asked me to stand so the entire crowd could honor my exceptional contribution. I stood up calmly from the shadows of the back row, smoothing down my blazer as I stepped into the light. Instantly, 300 people turned around in their seats to face me, their eyes wide with awe before erupting into a massive wave of thunderous applause. The roaring ovation completely eclipsed the polite clap Julian had received just moments before. My parents completely froze, their bodies turning entirely rigid as they stared back at me. My mother's mouth hung open in a silent gasp, and my father's face drained of all color, his hands suspended midair as if paralyzed by the shock. Julian stood entirely forgotten on the stage, his smug smirk completely vanished, replaced by an expression of sheer humiliation. For 22 years, they had looked down on me, completely blind to my true worth. But now, in front of everyone they wanted to impress, the tables had turned, and they were completely powerless to stop it. The truth was, I wasn't the struggling failure my parents desperately wanted to believe I was. Over the last decade, while they completely ignored me, I had quietly built a highly successful tech consulting firm from the ground up. I intentionally kept my wealth entirely hidden from them to protect my assets from my parasitic family, who constantly drained resources to fund Julian's incredibly expensive, reckless lifestyle. Julian certainly didn't earn his degree on academic merit. My parents had no idea that their golden boy had nearly been expelled for unpaid fees months ago, and it was my anonymous trust that quietly stepped in to fund his entire remaining tuition. Not only that, but the very deed to the luxury house my parents currently lived in belonged to me, bought out from under their mounting debts during their last unacknowledged financial disaster. The dean continued speaking, adjusting his microphone as he warmly praised my deep humility. He highlighted to the stunned audience that I had demanded absolutely no public recognition or special favors for my funding, fully intending to remain completely silent until the university's board decided to surprise me with this public honor today. I stood tall, feeling the crushing weight of a decade of secrecy melt away under the auditorium lights. My parents' manufactured illusion of who is truly successful in our family had just been completely shattered in front of 300 witnesses, and there was absolutely no going back. The moment the commencement ceremony concluded, Richard and Eleanor frantically swarmed toward me through the dispersing crowd, their faces twisted into desperate, manufactured smiles of fake affection. Julian trailed behind them, looking utterly small and defeated. "Nora, darling, we always knew you were capable of greatness," my mother exclaimed, reaching out to hug me. I calmly stepped back, refusing her touch, and pulled the thick manila folder from under my arm. Without saying a word, I coldly handed them official legal notices demanding the immediate, full repayment of Julian's hidden tuition debts and the back rent owed on the luxury house they had been occupying. Julian gasped as he realized his entire future, status, and lifestyle were completely dependent on the sister he had spent his life mocking. My parents were finally forced to face the harsh reality of their own financial ruin and Julian's lack of real-world skills. Leaving them speechless in the middle of the crowded lobby, I turned around and walked out of the building permanently, ready to live my life entirely on my own terms. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever had a family member take credit for your silence or treat you? Let me know the city you are watching from. Meanwhile, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for